All right, so I'll start off. I do moderate really lightly. I'm just basically here as a bouncer in case anybody's abusive. And you don't look like an abusive crowd, so I hopefully don't have to do much. I don't know about, Mr. McDonald back there. We might have to keep an eye on him. But,
that's the one I was worried about.
So maybe we could start off with two things. One would be if you could each introduce yourself, tell us what committees you're working on, high level, what bills you've looked on. And then maybe second, just to get into some meat, maybe some, I understand what Clotilde was saying before is we're not trying to talk about the drama at the federal level, I'll just put it that way, but some of the bill, particularly the one that passed out of the House, has some very significant ramifications for Vermont, and I assume the legislature, which could potentially have to go back into session again. Yeah, so that's where I want to go, and you can just maybe touch on that and the ramifications, and you can introduce yourselves to begin. And then we'll take questions from the audience.
Well, thank you, Jim, and Clotilde for the introduction. Appreciate you all for showing up. The bill he's referring to is, of course, the Ed Bill, H454. That's the bill that would have us not adjourned at this time, but basically recessed indefinitely. So the analogy I could offer is it's like kind of taking the phone off the hook. We're not taking calls or making calls. We're kind of killing time day by day. Senate and the House are in conflict about the details of that bill. We'll get into that more. I'm Jay Hooper. I represent the 5 towns of Brookfield, Braintree, Randolph, Granville, Roxbury. I'm in my 5th term. I serve on the Government Operations and Military Affairs Committee. And this session, we have been really a productive group of lawmakers around the table, 11 of us. We passed out quite a few bills. One of them, more recently, was an AI bill. We basically want to regulate artificial intelligence as it impacts elections. Basically, the bill was to create something of like a sort of similar to a Surgeon General's warning in advertisements that are utilizing synthetic media, so basically artificial intelligence in imagery. We would prefer that the candidate or the funder of the candidate put a disclosure on the advertisement itself that would make it abundantly obvious from sort of first look that that's false information. That wasn't a partisan issue. It did kind of shape up to be voted along party lines, and that probably has to do with the nature of the conversation that took place in committee. Another bill in my committee that is sort of high profile, particularly from a politics perspective, was the charter change that Burlington voters overwhelmingly asked the legislature to approve of, which is to ban guns in bars in the city of Burlington. All of that does have it kind of boils into the overall politics of the House and Senate relations relative to the governor on the Ed bill. Again, we'll get into that a little more deeply later. But other than that, right now we are at an impasse, the House and the Senate on the Ed bill, and we're kind of waiting on information. I think they're going to meet on Wednesday and Thursday and Friday with the goal of having something for us to dig into over the weekend. Going into next week, we're going to meet on the 16th, which is, I guess, a week from today, right? Hopefully we have something more to report to Vermonters. But over the course of this session, the last 4 or 5 months, I've been sort of ad nauseum saying to my colleagues, and particularly to leadership in both the House and the Senate, that we are not doing enough to collectively, as lawmakers, to dig into the material at hand. We have too few hard powers dealing with a conversation that they'd rather keep sort of guardrailed. My argument has been there's no way to do that. You have to involve everybody. You've got to field preference over and over and over from every direction, and special interests are obstacles in this type of conversation, as it is such a huge, multi-layered set of discussions about things that are controversial, really uncomfortable. So the future of public education belongs to all of us, and I think right now we're observing what it looks like to have sort of no plan because too few people put their heads together at the 11th hour, and we'll see what happens.
So I'm Larry Satkowitz. I represent the same district that Day does, that you all live in, and I'm on the Environment Committee. This is my third term, and I'm the ranking member of Environment. And I want to just tell you a little bit about some of the bills that I've been working on personally, and also some of the ones that have been passed out on my committee that I think are important to let you know about. This year we passed a couple of fish and wildlife bills that are a lot of housekeeping, but also two parts of I was particularly happy to see. One was a whole set of protections for reptiles and amphibians, which our state does not currently have. And the other section was particularly joyful, is that probably not the right word, but for me, because it was significant, because in the previous session, I had introduced a bill that would tighten up some of our threatened and endangered species statutes in a bill that did not get a lot of traction, but some of the language in that bill was picked up by the Fish and Wildlife Department's suggested bills this year and was actually signed by the governor the other day. So it felt really good to see some of that work make it all the way through and become state law. I've also been working on a bill that would greatly restrict the use of certain kinds of rodenticides in the state. It's a real problem because these kinds of, they're called anticoagulant rodenticides, and they are eaten by mice and rats and those kinds of creatures, but then those creatures go out into the environment to die. And then those creatures get eaten by their predators, birds of prey, coyotes, fishers, other creatures, and then they get poisoned by them. And the poison gets spread throughout the whole ecosystem. We also know that these chemicals are used way more than are really necessary. People use them because they're convenient and easy, but they're really not more effective than lots of other methods which have much less effect on the environment. That's a bill that was taken up by the Agriculture Committee. They didn't finish working on it this year, but they're going to pick it up again when we start up again in January. I'm very hopeful that that bill is going to come to a happy conclusion, and we're going to reduce the use of this poison in our environment. And for folks who say, well, it's just a bunch of animals out in the environment, I don't care that much about that. Nationwide, tens of thousands of human beings get poisoned by these chemicals every year, and countless numbers of domestic pets. So it's really a public health problem as well, and I'm really hoping that we can rein that in a bit with this bill that I've introduced this year. I also introduced a bill that would restrict in some very specific ways short-term rentals, Airbnb, those kinds of businesses. We know that those short-term rentals are having an effect on our housing market in a way which is not healthy. The true extent of that is up for somewhat debate. Some people say it's a really big effect. Some people say it's not a big deal. I think it's probably someplace in between. I think it's something that's worth regulating given the importance of housing right now. It's one of our biggest topics, and I'm hoping to see that bill also gain some more traction next year. And then the other bill, which I've introduced a number of times, which I'm really hoping finally gets somewhere next year, which did get a hearing in Jay's committee, is a bill that would, well, I guess I should describe the situation for a second first. There are places all over the state where people let junk pile up in their yards. And sometimes they do it, it's out of sight, it's not a big deal. Sometimes they do it temporarily, they clean it up, it's not a big deal. Sometimes they do it and the towns notice and they say, hey, you gotta clean this up. And they do it and it's no big deal. Sometimes the towns say, hey, you gotta clean it up. They don't do it, they get fined. they get taken to court, and then they say, okay, we'll deal with it, and then it becomes not a problem. And sometimes, despite all that work, there are still some people, and this exists all over the state, who say, I don't care what you do, you can find me all you want, I'm not cleaning it up. We have a case of this in downtown Randolph in the village, right outside downtown. I don't know how many people are familiar with that area. There's a street off of Dudley Street, off of Weston Street called Dudley Street, and there's a property there which has been in horrible shape for many, many years. The town has made extensive contact with the landowners, trying to get it cleaned up over an extended period of time. It's gotten so bad that we've placed liens on the property, the town has. I say we because I'm on the select board, and it's my group. And they say, fine, put liens on the house. We don't care. Their property is in such bad shape that it has negative value. So having a lien doesn't mean anything to them. And so we've run out of recourse. We can't do anything anymore to get this cleaned up. If you don't pay your taxes, or if you don't pay your water bill, the town can put your property up for tax sale if it goes through the proper procedure to get to that point, which is at the end of a long process. But for something like this, we don't have that kind of tool. So my bill would basically do this one simple thing. It would say, if you've gone through this whole process and you still won't clean up your property, the town will be able to take the fines that you owe and put them up for a tax sale, just like we do for people who don't pay their taxes or their water bills. And it got some hearing in the GovOps committee, and I know there were some members who were thinking that it was a good bill, but it didn't get all the way through the process, and we'll see what happens next year. I'm hoping that it'll get a little further. So those are the things that I've been personally working on. And then in committee, we've worked on a handful of environmental protection bills. We passed a bill out of the House that would further ban certain products that contain PFAS, which is a chemical which is ubiquitous at this point, which as we learn more about it, we get more and more afraid of its effects, and it's really important for us to be getting those products out of our environment, and we passed a bill that's going to take a bunch of them out. It's an iterative process. It's going to happen over time, but we've made progress. We passed another bill which is going to help us have less salt applied to mostly to private roads and parking lots. The idea behind this bill, and this is modeled after a very successful program in New Hampshire, which has been going on for a decade, whereby commercial salt applicators can get trained to have best practices, so they learn how to apply salt in ways that maximize the efficiency and also do it in a way which is still safe for people who need to use those surfaces and travel over them and walk over them. But the folks who apply salt, they are always afraid of getting sued, right? Someone slips and falls, they don't want that problem, and so they err on the side of often putting way too much salt down, more than they need to. And what this bill would do is a voluntary program that would allow them to go through a training program where they would get certified as an applicator, and in return, they would get a certain amount of limited liability, because they would basically be able to show that they follow best practices, that what they do is safe, and that they're doing the best that they can do without having to apply more salt that won't actually help the situation. We already have some waterways in our state which are impaired by salt, and that's just getting worse. The salt builds up in the environment faster than it gets washed out, and if we don't do something about it soon, we're going to have more and more waterways that are going to start to die because there's just too much salt in them. These are freshwater bodies. They're not supposed to have salt in them. The creatures in them didn't evolve to live in salty environments. And so that's sort of the overview of the work that I've been doing this past session, and that's been all really good, and I'm looking forward to hear some of your questions and talk more about some of the bigger pieces that the legislature has been involved in.
And last minute, Larry introduced a bill to basically make it so that police in Randolph don't have to.
Yeah, I wasn't going to mention that because it's so specific, but thank you for bringing that up.
He's doing a lot.
So in my role as a select board member, I've been very much involved with the police and the police union in town, and Randolph is having a really hard time hiring police officers. We've been understaffed. We have openings for the entire time since we've restarted the force, and one of the big reasons right now is that, for reasons that we won't get into because it's too weedy, the union that the town employees are a part of, it's a 30-year retirement setup. Most police in the state, though, are on a 20-year cycle. And so the police that they sign up, they interview for a job, and then we tell them what union they'd have to be a part of, and they're like, you mean I have to work an extra 10 years if I come and join your force than if I worked someplace else? And we're like, yeah, you still want to work here, right? And they're like, no, thank you. That's a long time to wait. And so I introduced a bill at the request of the town that would change the state statute. It's crazy that this has to be like a statute thing, but that's the way it works. That instead of the police having to belong to one union, they would be allowed to belong to a different union that would be on more favorable terms for them. Thanks, Jay.
Yeah, what I mean to say is he's doing a lot of good policy work, and I'm kind of doing more like, everybody, we got to work together on education. Jim, what's next?
Great. So who has a question?
This has to do with education, but it also has to do with how we view ourselves as a state. And if it doesn't come out as a question, I apologize in advance.
No worries.
It seems to me that the elephant in the room is that we're not looking in the right place for revenue. That instead of looking at funding our education system through income tax, we are doing a hybrid system, which is better than a lot of states, but is still not doing what needs to be done. If I had to say a question, it would be, how do we justify sticking kids on a bus for 2 extra hours because we've closed their schools and think that that's good for anyone? Is it good for the kids? No, it isn't. I've taught kids who were on buses for an hour, and they were kindergartners. And by the time I had them for music in the afternoon, I had to tell them stories to keep them awake. Is it good for the town that loses its school? Absolutely not, because all the young people leave then. Why should they live in a town with no school? But that's where we're headed. That's where we're headed. And it's all because, oh my God, my taxes are too high. Well, if we looked at another way of raising revenue, we might be able to solve that problem. My question is, why the hell aren't we seriously considering funding through the property tax, through income tax instead of property tax? Definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over that fails and thinking somehow the results are going to be different. So why aren't we doing this? Is it because of lobbyists? Is it because of the fear that, oh my God, the wealthy people will leave the state, which is unfounded by any survey I've ever seen? So what's going on here?
I'm glad you did end up articulating a question, but of course the question you've asked is one that neither of us could answer definitively. Your two lobbyists and this fear that wealthy people will up and leave are, of course, both residual variables. It feels to me like for the first time in a long time, we're actually in a place where we could potentially consider this concept that has been on the table for decades. I think it's Vermont's Public Assets Institute that has the leading proposal to that effect, transitioning from a property tax-based system to an income tax-based system. Of course, we would still tax property, but the way, basically right now, what our Ways and Means Committee and Senate Finance, what they're digging into is how should we categorize property, and therefore at what threshold should we categorically tax it. I guess, Eric, to answer your question, the forecast right now is sort of maybe similar to the weather outside. we are at an impasse currently, and my prediction is that because we have no real bill right now, H.4 54 is on the table, but like nobody knows exactly what table and in what form, and when exactly we're gonna chop it into a list of ingredients that go into a final meal or whatever we end up deciding to vote on this session. I get the impression that we're gonna shape up to have to come back for a special session for 4 to 6 weeks or thereabouts, maybe 2 months, and actually dig into this question. So I'm optimistic, but to a limit.
Yeah, and it's a really great question. I could probably sit here and answer that question for the remainder of this time, but I'll try to keep it a lot shorter than that. I agree with you. We should definitely be raising more money from the wealthiest folks in our society who can afford it. They've done very well for a very long time now, and especially recently. And the income inequality in our society, and Vermont is not quite as extreme in some places, but we have it here too. It's really unfair to ordinary people who are struggling to get by, while people who are in the top 5 to 10%, but especially the 1 or 2%, are really doing extremely well. So those are sources of revenue that we should be tapping, absolutely. If it was just up to me, we would be raising money from those high income earners, and we would be moving to more of an income-based tax instead of a property tax for education. Why hasn't that happened? One of the big reasons why it hasn't happened over the last 8 years is because we have a governor who opposes it. He doesn't want to see any extra taxes upon high earners, and he'll say things like what you said, oh, those people, they're just going to leave the state and it's going to be bad. We know that that's not true. The data is very clear. There's a very, very small number of folks who will leave a place because they're getting taxed more. But compared to the amount of extra money that's raised by those taxes, it's beneficial to the state in a very clear way. It also has the nice effect of being a more just and fair way of running our society.
Tax the rich.
So, and then to go along with that, and to talk about housing for a moment, which is the other big pieces, which is driving a lot of issues that we're having in our state, is we have, I think the number is 30,000 second homes in Vermont. It's a huge number, and if you think about the folks who own those homes, most of those homes are owned by wealthier than average folks. Lots of people who don't live in Vermont, and it's really hard for me to fathom why we're not taxing those homes at a higher rate. There are communities, I don't think this is the case right here in our district, but there are communities where second homes are actually taxed at a lower tax rate than homestead home properties. It's crazy. It's crazy.
What's the argument for not taxing the second homes at a higher rate than first homes?
It typically has a lot to do with hunting camps and Vermonters who have another property in Vermont.
But those are not the problem properties I'm really talking about.
No, it's not right. But that is the thing, that's the kind of hang up in a lot of cases.
But again, it also comes back to this, for folks who think that income inequality is okay and that people who are wealthy somehow deserve everything that they get, that we should not be sort of asking more of them. I don't think that's the right way to look at the world. I don't think the world really works that way. I think that people who are the most successful in our society are a lot of times the ones who have most benefited from the education system, from our roads, from our infrastructure, from our justice system, right? Those are the folks who have really made out well, and they should be giving back more than other folks in a proportionate way, because they have economically benefited more than the rest of us, and that just seems fair. But there are folks who don't see it that way, including the governor, who doesn't see it that way.
So this is somewhat related to that is...
Next time I want to get this gentleman who did have his hand up. In the beginning.
That was my bad. I should let the moderator do his job.
Do you mind if I go to the gentleman who had his hand up first, like 5-10 minutes ago?
All right. During the session, how many foundation formula versions have there been? And have you seen them? And if you actually do see them, are you able to tell if our district would spend more per pupil than it did recently or less?
According to whatever the new formula that would be generated. My understanding is that the Randolph, I'm not as sure about the Granville and Roxbury situation, but my understanding is that the Randolph, Brookfield, Braintree district, that's supervisory district, would not be really much affected by H454 one way or the other. The class size minimums we meet, we're not in danger of where we don't underfund our schools like they do in some parts of the state. There's not a lot that I've been able to come across that shows that we would see any sort of dramatic changes in our area. Long term, the big change could be that in a bigger district, there could be high school consolidation, and we would find that we would, build a new high school, would involve possibly some kids being on buses a little longer. But that's really unsure. Our high schools right now would meet the sizes that are envisioned in the bill, and the big reason for building more centrally would be, like in Randolph's case, I think we have the oldest high school in the state right now, which hasn't been updated. And the administrators there told me that it really needs it, but the cost is prohibitive. And so any kind of change in the building is going to have to be part of some sort of bigger picture, just from a financial structure point of view. And what that looks like is going to be a years-long conversation. So in terms of how the bill might affect us, that would be one of the ways. But it's really hard to say exactly what that would look like. It could be that they just decide, in a bigger district, that the way we have it set up right now is just fine, or there might be, movement towards a more of a consolidation of those upper grades. It would have to be something that would be agreed upon by, all the communities that would be affected in similar ways too.
Do you have a follow-up to that? I don't know if this is about the rumor, there's been talk about Brookfield Elementary closing, and that was put forth. I didn't know if that was in response.
I just want to know how many versions are there?
Yeah.
1 or 20?
Probably about 3 different versions, and that would be based on.
There's a House version, a Senate version.
Yeah, and
the governor version.
So basically the 3 different iterations of the foundation formula proposal. So basically there's become a general consensus that we have to explore a foundation formula. We have to get away from, of all the 50 states, we have the most unique funding formula of any state in the union. And that's because we have a commitment to equity in theory, in concept. We have what's called weights, WEIGHT, that go into the averagization of per pupil spending district to district, which I'm sure you're aware of. The difference between the initial proposal, which the governor, the base amount per pupil would be $15,348. $15,348 or something like that. The Senate, I think, then pitched something closer to $16,000 and change. And then today's iteration, or whatever we're working on now, is down in the 14 range. But the point is that the next highest spending per pupil on a base funding formula amount state is Colorado, and they're about $8,700 something per student. So we're talking about a very different set of math variables, but currently we have a formula that is really complicated. It doesn't create equity, even though in theory you know, on paper, it's the most equitable compared to any other state. You know, if you've got basically two general categories of funding like foundation formula approaches state to state, and we're one of the few that doesn't fit a category. There are like 4 states that are not resource-based nor, what's the other? Basically, we're unique, and Vermont now has to figure out how to become a little bit more straightforward. And to answer your question, there are probably 3 different foundation formulas. Was there a second part to your question?
Oh, I think the other answered that part.
Yeah.
So basically the same as it was before.
Yeah.
I spent quite a bit of time talking to our local superintendent about, you know, what do you think of this bill that we just passed out of the House? How is this going to affect us here? And he's like, you know what? It's not a perfect bill. There's things about it which I think could have been done differently, but it's a good bill. It puts us on the path that, you know, is moving us in the right direction, and I support it. And I think the superintendent has a good perspective. I trust his judgment, and so it made me feel more comfortable supporting the bill.
But Randolph does pretty well with our latest iteration of the weights. We updated the weights in 2018, and the districts that are of lesser resources tend to do better, as opposed to what we refer to as gold towns. The wealthier towns in the state end up paying into the formula quite a lot more than towns like Randolph and Brookfield and Braintree.
And if I could, I'd like to bring back to one of the first things that Eric said, which was wondering about schools closing and the bill forcing schools to close. And that's been a big topic in the legislature about, you know, what is the future of small schools, and what's the role of the state in helping to determine whether they stay open or not. And what's been really pointed out to me in a very clear way is small schools are closing now. In fact, and you know, we've talked about schools closing, you know, in our district, and the pressures are very real. And this bill doesn't increase the pressures that already exist. It's not going to suddenly say, you know, these schools which were fine before are now going to have a problem. If schools are doing well now, if they're well funded, if they're well attended, if they're well functioning, they're most likely going to be well placed under the current House version of the bill. If they're struggling now, yeah, they're probably going to continue the struggle because the basic economics of those particular places, you know, it kind of is what it is.
Ma'am, do you have a question?
I want to ask about the influence of like the Airbnb economy in some respects on the state, on local housing, and how you see that potentially being addressed. And because I do know that Airbnb has lobbyists in the state, and from everything that I've read on a national level, how aggressive they are in targeting legislators at a state level who try to do any sort of regulation of the Airbnb market. And it does go to what you said, Larry, about people are using property as an investment and a way to make even more money that then makes it less affordable for people who are working and trying to own in that area.
Yeah, the moment that bill got introduced, I heard from those people.
Yeah.
It didn't take them long at all. I heard from them loud and clear. The effects of the short-term rentals on the housing market vary tremendously from place to place. So there are communities where these sorts of investors are welcomed with open arms because there's not a lot of other economic activity. And so there are folks who are coming in and they're buying houses which are not in great shape, they're fixing them up, and they're renting them out. They're in really rural areas, not a lot of other activity, and the people in those communities are like, the more of this we can get, the better. Like there's really not a lot of downside for us for a lot of these. On the other end of the spectrum, we have places like Burlington, which has passed its own short-term rental ordinance where they're regulating it in their municipality, where they've seen real effects of investors buying up single-family homes, buying up multifamily units and renting them out like a little hotel. And they've seen the negative effects in their communities because of that. And then we have like other places like, you might have a community like Killington where there's a really big short-term rental market, but most of it is on the mountain, right, on the ski mountain. And to say to people, oh, you can't rent out your condo that you use to ski, like, that's crazy. Of course they should be able to do that. And so the bill that I introduced basically said everybody everywhere on a parcel can have one short-term rental. So if you have a house and an accessory dwelling unit and you want to convert that accessory dwelling unit to a short-term rental, go crazy. If you own a duplex and you want to live in one and rent out the other one, fine. But if you have 3 units or more, you can only rent out one of them as a short-term rental, and the other ones need to be for long-term rentals. And if you have a single-family home, you can't rent that out as a short-term rental at all. However, the bill that I introduced gave local communities the ability to opt out of either of those provisions. So if you're one of those communities where you say, we like people coming in and buying up our single-family homes, fixing them, and making them places that are generating revenue for us, then that community can opt out of that part of the bill. And also, if you're a community that says, for whatever reason, it's okay with us if someone rents out, more than one unit on their property as a single-family rent, as a short-term rental. We like that. Again, they can go through a public process in their community and opt out of that. What the bill then does is it gives all the sort of little communities and mid-sized communities that don't have, like Burlington, it's easy for Burlington to create an ordinance that then says, here's how we're going to handle this. They have the municipal staff, they have the resources to put that kind of thing into effect and then to enforce it. Most communities, that's a pretty big lift. And so what my bill would do is it would basically say, here's the default. And if your community is struggling getting this off the ground, well, here you go. We're doing it for you at the state level. But if this isn't going to work for you, you have the options to do it differently. And so it would give communities real flexibility, but it would also give the communities that don't have the municipal wherewithal to enact such local ordinances, it would lift that burden from them.
Yes, sir.
You said we're not talking national politics, so I won't do that. But I just want
We're not editorializing national politics.
not editorializing. So I'm just curious the extent to which in the State House this year discussion of future effects on Vermont and Vermont's budget has come up. Governor's made a big deal about the buy down of property taxes. A number of voices have said, hey, wait a minute, there's a storm on the horizon.
Right.
And whatever aspect of the bill that came through the U.S. Congress, okay, if you're talking about Medicaid, if you're talking about FEMA, if you're talking about even just road maintenance and highway maintenance, there's likely to be fairly big holes that get punched in Vermont's budget in the next few years. And so I'm just sort of curious to what extent that has played into the discussion about the education bill, because we can, you can slog it out for another 2 months, okay, come up with this beautifully crafted education bill, and then, we get punched in the face.
We have our big, beautiful education.
Exactly. So just curious the extent to which that is a consideration that has already been discussed and raised in the State House this year.
Good question. We have been looking to our federal delegation, Welch, Ballant, Sanders, our Vermont State Treasurer, Mike Pichek, to kind of put their heads together and think about first team all Vermont, how do we make sure we're as best positioned. What's our best footing for whatever we might anticipate coming to our doorstep in the way of uncertainty. Those folks have been doing that constantly, and we would have very little to suggest as to any insight on what's going on there. But I will say, I did sit in on a Friday morning. The House Education Committee took testimony from the secretary. Well, I guess, I don't know if Secretary Zoe Saunders wasn't in the hot seat, but her two sidekicks were. They had just been to Washington. They kind of got a snapshot of like what could come, and basically they said, we just have to keep working business as usual and hope for the time being that at least one more fiscal year, is to ensue before major change takes place, so that like we can buy ourselves another year of time the cogs are turning. We're thinking about that. We definitely, I think the Agency of Education is taking that very seriously. What should we expect for shortfalls from the federal government in the way of education funding, particularly as the department nationally kind of has been gutted. So more to come, not too much to know.
Can I follow up on his question a little bit, just to say, to me, the one that's related to education, is related to housing, and that all flows through, is the threats to Medicaid, which I heard could leave a $200 million hole in the Vermont budget. Is there any truth to that? And is that like a come back to session in September type thing, if that happens? Because I think that's what's currently in the House proposal right now.
Right. Yeah, and it's sort of across the legislature, the committees who oversee the various parts of, the state government, the administration. I know I've been taking testimony around what federal money are we receiving in the state? Where is it going? Where is it? What parts of the federal government is it coming from? How likely do the people think it is to be affected by what's going on? So there's sort of just a lot of information. People are just sort of educating themselves on the big picture. What's the landscape look like? In terms of actually planning, it's really hard because we just don't really know what's going to get cut, where the revenue might come from or not come from. So the approach has really just been one of, just watchful waiting. We're going to continue in a modest way, kind of the way that we've been going, and respond as necessary. Sort of like a lot of businesses are doing around the country, where they're not hiring new people, and they're not changing their ways too much because of the incredible uncertainty out there in the economy. It's a very similar situation with the state, where we're going to have a hard time trying to start a lot of big new things, but it doesn't make sense to start trying to cut programs proactively, because it might come to nothing. So we're sort of acquiring information so that when things do happen, we'll be as ready as we can be. And I think that's the approach that has been taken across the legislature.
And if like a $200 million cut to Medicaid comes through, do you expect that the legislature will reconvene and then go into a mode of we're going to have to cut?
We're going to have to figure it out, yeah.
Yep. We're going to have to convene, I think, and figure that out. And actually, I think we're probably going to have to get sort of creative regionally with sort of a recovery plan with the surrounding states.
Yeah, it's scary.
It is. But, Sheldon.
Back to education details. It was reassuring, Larry, to hear you say that the bills, as you've seen them, would not have an immediate impact on small schools like Brookfield. That said, I'm hard time believing that it's possible that a school that has a 4th grade
I believe.
And also like teacher-student ratio, that was something else.
Yeah, I think the version that passed the House had 12 students per class for elementary school on average. So that's an average. So, if you have, like I know like in Randolph, there are combined classes. Like there's a 1-2 class, a 3-4 class. I'm not sure what it's like in Brookfield. So if you have a 3-4 class, it would be the whole class, not just the individual grade. So if you had 6 kids in each grade and you had 12, then you would meet the class size minimum. And it's also an average. So, you could have one class that's 10, but if you had a bigger group that went through, ahead of them, they could average it out. It also averages out it's also over a period of time. So if you have 1 year where you're not meeting them, it's not like, oh my gosh, we didn't meet it this year, now we're done. Next year's better, then you're better. And then there's other procedure and process that would have to go through before a school would close under those sorts of circumstances also. So really the schools that would close who are not meeting these minimums, they're probably struggling anyway because they're so small, it's so expensive. And the local taxpayers at a certain point are going to say, this is really expensive. I mean, we've started to have these conversations here in our district already, regardless of this bill. And I think that's really what's going to play out across the state. Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Does 454 incorporate these changes? The governor wanted to cut Vermont down to 5 regions, which sounds crazy.
5 school districts? It doesn't. So 454 is what we call a strike all. So basically every line in the governor's proposal was stricken from the bill. And the House Education Committee dug into some of those very specific sort of pressure points, class sizes, student-teacher ratios, tuitioning, definition of independent schools, some components to Chapter 13, like governance and supervisory unions versus districts, these kinds of things. So no, his 5 school districts, not on the table. And the other thing too is there is general consensus. I went around the first few weeks of the session, so the House Clerk's office has a roster of all the names of the 150 reps. For every time we vote, there's a yes, no, absent column, so you can keep track of how everybody voted on a certain piece of policy. I used one of those lists of names to go around and field preference from all of our colleagues, or as many as I could, probably about 125. I didn't get everybody, but close. 5 districts was pretty much nobody's preference. The most common preference was 17 districts, and the reason was because a lot of lawmakers feel instinctively that if there are 17 career technical education centers, perhaps that's the configuration we should sort of think about. But there were suggestions of anywhere from 30 to 1. The state of Hawaii, I believe, is the only one with 1 school district. It's sort of like, I don't know, dredging the rivers. Does that just like move the problem down the river? I don't know, but.
New York City is 1 school district, 8 million people.
Right, so that's a huge city. The point is we've got quite a lot to talk about when it comes to thinking about how many school districts there ought to be. But to answer your question, 5 is not on the table, no. And 454 is a policy that will see quite a lot of change in the next 20 days, I imagine. That it's really hard to suggest to you all what's gonna or not gonna happen. So it's kind of precarious,
It's not going to be 5.
No, I mean, some changes I'm sure have to be made, but let's do maybe gradual changes instead of taking a chainsaw to it.
Agreed, right. And the tone of the conversation is about equity and property taxation. So obviously we all believe that we need to make some profoundly bold and courageous change as to a transition over the next 5 to 30 years. But currently, we are really not sitting at the same table on the philosophical disagreements. So hopefully, we see that change.
And I think I could tell you with some certainty that the House folks who are most deeply involved in writing 454 would never characterize it as taking a chainsaw to our system. They really honestly and emphatically are trying to create something which works better for kids and creates a system which we can also at the same time afford. That's really the goal. Will we make mistakes as we try to get there? I'm sure we will. It's impossible to do anything of any significance without, having to readjust. But really, that is the goal.
And to the politics, the House members, the chair of House Education, the chair of House Ways and Means, they are defending public education at large from they don't want the senators to sort of take an inch on the definition of independent schools as it relates to historic academies like Burr and Burton. The Senate is very much the other side of that coin in terms of if we're talking about a disagreement, it's along those lines. Independent versus public. And tuition, public dollars, where they go, what the rules are for that. That's the kind of...
Yeah, and that is one of the parts of the bill which would significantly affect certain places in terms of communities that have independent schools or who are used to tuitioning their students to various schools, whether they're public or independent. But again, we don't have a lot of that here in this area. Almost every...
Do you want to define it?
You guys are working on it. When we say independent, what's in the basket of independent schools?
Well,
it's all the schools that aren't public schools. It's all the schools that aren't public schools. And then
confined to the state of Vermont?
Well, right now, no. We fund schools. I see where this is going. Currently we fund with public money schools which are not within our borders. We do that. There are certain communities which routinely send their students out of state and apparently at times out of the country. And we spend money in those places on those students' education.
So school choice.
We pay for private schools in other countries and other states?
In some cases, yes.
Yep.
And the way 454 is written, that would end.
Yep. So that's there are some,
except for there's certain communities which are on the border, and so there's a place I think in Massachusetts and in New Hampshire,
Dresden.
There's a couple of very special spots that we don't want to mess with because it works basically, but we don't want to be sending more public money to ski academies in Colorado or people going to private schools out of the country, things like that.
More questions for Larry and Jay?
Mark had one, I thought, or was that the one? That was your question?
He was teeing me up.
Well,
How many districts are there now?
112.
Okay.
There are about 62 supervisory unions, but a supervisory union could have as many as 3 different districts within it.
Oh, okay.
And so I just figured I'll take this opportunity to share with you all a map that I created for particularly the members of the education committees to look at, but basically to Shelby's question and others about consolidation, I think we should be focusing specifically on high schools, and it should be on the basis of our understanding of the facilities needs index. So our school construction profile, the most expensive schools like Randolph I think Randolph ranks number 1, right, Sam? Is that correct? And for most in need of new infrastructure. So I'm going to pass this map around. This basically is the 55 public high schools in the state ranked by enrollment. And the green towns are the ones with 700 students or more. The blue towns are between 400 and 650. The yellow ones are between 300 and 400 students, and all of the pink highlighted towns are 300 students or fewer. So this is to give a snapshot of the landscape based on the geography. What is it that we're looking at visually? So if you would indulge me, you can pass that around. But basically what I'm trying to do is encourage members of the House and the Senate to think about high schools before elementary schools, because those are the hearts of communities. We're going to do considerable damage. Act 46 is a good example of where consolidation could have worked, maybe, but that policy didn't prove that it does. If anything, it seems to me today, there are a lot of people who make the argument that consolidation, in fact, does not create savings. I don't believe that. I'm not compelled one way or the other. The point is that there's no compelling data to either direction. So we have to be far more detail informed with our transition plan as we think about the future of public education in Vermont. And the thing I've been devoting each Saturday, I have a radio show from 11 to noon on Saturday mornings, and I've been bringing in guests to talk about this subject. And more recently, I've been trying to kind of flesh out the community schools model, which is basically wraparound government services, social services from a regional high school, like one-stop shop. You can get your dental hygiene, your food, food insecure families can get assistance with a sort of a food shelf component to the high school, shampoo, counseling, the services that families need to grow and thrive would come from the same place. And I think it would help eliminate the duplicative nature of certain government bureaucracies as we think about the future of all public institutions, particularly as we have very uncertain forecasts from the federal government. I don't mean to editorialize, but DOGE, it seems kind of interesting to me that there's kind of a feud going on between the world's most powerful individual and the world's richest individual. Used to be buddies. This week they're not quite as friendly as they were, I don't think. But.
So I'll wing you, not to go dark here, and what keeps you up at night? Nothing, and don't bring in your personal lives, okay? What are you, as a legislator, most worried about could happen to us as a state? And I do, not to overuse a cliche, it is kind of an unprecedented time, I imagine, that you're doing this work with this backdrop of big changes potentially happening. So I'm just curious, outside of your committee, what are you most concerned about?
I'm most concerned about the sort of fundamental nature of our society. It's as housing costs have gotten higher and higher, it's becoming really hard for ordinary people to live here, and I don't think it's healthy for Vermont as a state to be a place that you have to be an upper income person to be able to say, I'm going to buy a house or even rent someplace to live. I worry about that, and I worry about for the people who are stretching themselves to stay because their rents went up or because they just bought a house which costs twice as much as it did 6 years ago, that there's things that they're giving up in terms of basic aspects of the quality of their life that are unhealthy. I think for me, that's the thing which I feel most concerned about. And the costs, housing is one of them, but hand in hand with that is healthcare costs. And at this point, I think property taxes are kind of a distant third. The thing with property taxes, though, is that if you're already a homeowner, that's where you feel it the most for a lot of us who may be more sheltered from the increased housing costs and perhaps from some of the increased healthcare costs. But between those three things, though, it's becoming a much more challenging environment to just live a basic good quality life.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Larry. The economy today is bad math for most people. And it feels like we're kind of coming to a juncture on that. Yeah, not to go dark. I guess, I'm going to try and bring it light after we go. So misinformation is my biggest fear. I think that we're going into a time where we're going to have a really hard time identifying what the difference is between reality and totally artificial imagery. Like just completely, I don't know if anybody saw on Facebook a couple months back, H91, is it H or S91? H. So we have had this sort of protracted disagreement about how we deal with Vermont's unhoused population, and the governor and the Senate and House Democrats. We've had these disagreements about the philosophy there, and a couple images I've seen on Facebook were pictures of Phil Scott sort of taking selfies in front of a tent city on the State House lawn. All of that was not real image, but it was generated by artificial intelligence. There are enough images of the governor out there and enough images of these concepts that a computer can generate these things, and most people would have a hard time being able to say quickly, oh, that's not real. In 3 years, it's going to be really, really hard to tell. And so that's why there's a sort of a urgency to pass an AI elections bill, which is to say you can't just willy-nilly influence. Misinformation should not be quite so protected by the First Amendment. There was an attorney in my committee who said something like, a politician has a right to lie. I said, ask any of my voters if they agree with that. I can't think of a single person who would say, I believe that's so true. Yeah, that makes sense. No, it doesn't. That's a terrible thing. So when it comes to my biggest fear, I think about children and our addiction to phones. I am not a child, but I am not that far from that addiction in terms of as an adult. I find myself closing my favorite and most readily used application on my phone only to open it back up before I've even turned off my phone screen. And that's a dopamine loop that I am trying to ditch. But the point is that we have to save kids. And so the light part of this is that we have a bill to take cell phones out of schools. And I think that we're going to succeed in doing that. So that's a really major thing. If we can create for a 4-year-old up to 8 years old to 12 years old, if these kids think that the cool thing to do is go out and go fishing, that's a healthy.
Thank you, Jay, for bringing us light again. I'm not sure between Larry and Mark who went, who went first?
Shall I?
Yeah, please.
A different subject I want to ask you about. Both of you, how do you see the political landscape right now in the state vis-a-vis Democrats and Republicans and independents? We know what we've had in existence in terms of the political mix 2 years ago with the Democrat supermajority, with the ability to easily veto the governor's veto, the veto.
Override, yeah.
Override, yeah. And the Republican Party kind of being what it was, not trying to reflect some of the Trumpian type of attitude, and then others, Republicans, just trying to get by, I guess.
Right.
And then we had the elections. Then we had some change in some increase in some Republican seats, unfortunately. But generally, it was not a massive change, but it was enough to take away the supermajority. Now, then, that new legislature with that new composition is now confronted with the massive issue of the education reform package. And we're now seeing the legislature somewhat at a standstill on this major issue, not coming to terms in a sequentially constructed way in trying to deal with the problem. Given that shift that's going on, how do you guys see the political environment in the state? What do you see?
I think there's maybe two different questions there. One is more specific around the politics around how we transform education. That's actually really interesting because, and I've heard this from a number of people, and I think it's probably true that that's one of the issues which is a good bit less partisan than much of the other stuff which we tend to fight about. And the reason is because the education issues tend to fall more unevenly around geography than around political party, around the state. So like we alluded to the independent schools, and there's parts of the state which are heavily invested in independent schools. And it's not about political party in those places. There's places where places have, tended to support their schools really strongly, and there's other places which have funded them less, and those are not as much around partisan issues as around the underlying economics of a community. And so what we're seeing is that the policies that are coming out, there's a lot of coalescence around certain ideas across party lines. And in fact, I was greatly heartened just the other day because something really rare happened, which was the Senate Pro Tem, the Speaker of the House, and the Governor all issued a joint statement saying the negotiations around the Ed bill need more time, but we're going to get there, and we're going to work together to make it happen. And you don't see that kind of joint statement from those three people. Like I'm not aware of another time, honestly.
I haven't seen this statement. When did
It came out like 4 or 5 days ago, something like that. So I think that's, as far as the Ed bill goes, are there politics? And of course there are. There are. I think there's a majority of Democrats who tend to coalesce around a certain set of policies around education, which are going to be a little differently than the way most Republicans tend to coalesce. But the differences between the parties there are not nearly as dramatic as some of the other things that we tend to fight about.
Yes, and I think the truest thing he said is that education, it's not partisan. We have ideological disagreements that are historic, no doubt, but I mean, Perry, you kind of highlighted how there are Republicans who are just trying to get by, separate from the Trump chaos, and then there are those of us sort of rural Democrats who are also trying to kind of survive. We're kind of an endangered species to be out here moderate, which I, for one, am trying to create a middle for people who don't pick one side or the other, which is the majority of Americans to kind of like live in a reasonable, calm place where you can share ideas and not be terrified of, you know, the backlash. So I think the way I would classify it is this very, very popular governor of ours, he has the megaphone. And we Democrats, the majority, have all the cards. So how do we play together? You know, instead of boxing like we have for the last 4 years, we ought to play volleyball, you know. Everybody get a touch in. Everybody should learn how to take a serve. The more people involved in the conversation, the more fruitful.
You do want to smash it on the other side.
Yeah, you can spike it. That's
Just
right.
every once in a while.
Exactly. He gets it. The analogy is there, right? So the point is that it is a game, and we should stop playing. We should not play checkers. We should make sure to figure out who our rooks are, who our bishops are, and how to protect the queen or the king while the queen, you know.
The one thing I correct, given what Larry just said, apparently the Democrats don't have the ability to spike the ball like
We have a hard. So I think to that, I think we on the left wing, right? We struggle. We have kind of a sort of a credibility deficit with ordinary people. We have a tendency to market things based on the signal, not as much the virtue anymore. I mean, we the Democrats have, I don't think, lost the working class, but you know, they're kind of like, I don't know. I mean, you get what I mean. I think we have to kind of reevaluate what it looks like to message and make sure that we are being authentic and not superficial and artificial. Text campaigns, not the future. Shouldn't be. I'm not getting a text message from Kamala Harris. I'm just not. You know? I'll give $5, but like, go out and shake hands, knock on doors, have a conversation. Don't be so judgmental. Maybe learn a thing, teach a thing, listen.
You mean that wasn't a real text?
She and I, yes.
Mark.
I want to go back to education and foundation plans. And for a decade before our current formula was done, there was like five different education formulas. Mm-hmm. Lasted 2 or 3 years, Miller and a couple others. And foundation came along. It was in place for most of the 80s and into the 90s. And then the Supreme Court of the state of Vermont ruled it unconstitutional. Mm-hmm. A new formula was put in place. It took 10 years to get off the unconstitutional. What is the difference between the foundation plan being proposed and the foundation plan that's similar to many others in the United States? What's the difference between that one and the one that you're proposing? Or the legislature's proposing.
Mark? Right. So he's referring to 1994. Amanda Brigham sued the state of Vermont. So the Brigham case. The difference, Mark, we couldn't tell you because we don't know exactly what the bill is right now, but just to make this easy, probably not very much of a difference. And we're going to see a court case, whether we like it or like whatever we do, somebody's going to sue, and we're going to have to go through the court system. But like that doesn't change the fact that we have the highest priority for voters in all towns in Vermont is to make sure that property taxes don't just continue to climb. And we have been on pace for that to continue to happen. So the legislative consensus is that we have to explore sort of ideas of the old. We're going to try and keep the weights. We're going to try and keep the variables that differentiate what the cost of a student is to another student based on all the weighted variables, high school students versus middle schoolers versus elementary school students and kindergartners versus English language learners, and the geography and then the socioeconomics of that district. There are a bunch of weights that we use to figure out how to make it an equitable averagization of per pupil spending. That is the difference.
So the foundation plan was found unconstitutional because it wasn't equitable.
Yes.
What is the difference that makes what's being proposed?
Can I get back to you on that?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to, because it's like, Mark, man, former Senator McDonald, welcome home. You got us. We don't know. We aren't sure yet.
So that wasn't one of the principles upon which this thing has been put forward?
It's definitely been in the mix, and it actually, I would say, is probably the foundation, for lack of a better word, to the reticence of the House members on this question is on the basis of your question. So how are we going to go backwards when the courts said we can't do that?
I know there's changes. I don't know enough about the history and the details of that court decision on the legal basis upon which it was found to be, unconstitutional in the state. I do know that the current bill that passed the House was crafted carefully with lots of input from Leg Counsel to make sure that it would pass, tests. It will, like Jay said, we'll likely still find ourselves in court over it, but the thinking is that this was constructed to prevail in the courts in Vermont. I wish I could give you a more detailed answer. It gets complicated fast, and I honestly just don't know all the history.
My next question was, you got a minimum number of students that you can have in class. What's the maximum?
The bill doesn't have a maximum. The bill does not talk about maximums.
It doesn't.
No.
It did at a time, but it doesn't now.
Really? I don't remember that.
Wait, the key adjective in the Brigham decision
Equity?
was the word no, adequate. That was the key word that the decision, as I recall,
Yes.
said that the old system did not provide an adequate education as guaranteed by the state constitution.
Right.
Yeah.
And as a result, it threw it out, and that's where.
So it's actually, I'm glad you, Perry, the great addition. Adequacy versus equity. Adequacy is the concept that the court system in our neighboring state of New Hampshire is stuck with. I guess their precedent is, what is the definition of adequate education for a student per pupil? Who will decide?
Considering this week, who decides how much is adequate? The townspeople or the state government?
All right.
State
We
government.
should get right into this.
So we're going to do a little time check here. We got we're trying to keep this to 8:30.
Yeah.
We're almost to 8:30. Okay. So maybe room for one more or two more quick questions. And Perry and Mark are going to have a class for another 45 minutes. Outside.
Well, I'll stay.
So here's for your next legislative session, because there's a Senate Bill S-66, which was co-sponsored by Dr. White, Windsor County, COSI, and it passed. It's on, what is that called? Passed Senate. What's that called?
It's moved over to the House?
No, it doesn't matter. And what the bill is
It
about.
made crossovers.
Crossover, thank you. It hit crossover, and that's where it's at.
Yep.
It asks to basically make it illegal to modify noise from motor vehicles, so modifications of mufflers, etc. And I'm curious, and I'm not giving you the whole bill, obviously, if that comes to the House, what are your opinions of that?
You tell us.
Bear in mind that I live on a state highway.
I mean, I have heard one senator gripe about this bill quite a few times. This Senator Richie Westman of the Cambridge area. He has strong feelings. I can't exactly remember which way because I'm like, I just think it's like a lot of noise from him, you know? So I don't know. I'd probably be supportive of that. What do you think? Should I?
Absolutely, if they're modifying something to make something noisier, I'd invite you to come to my house anytime on a Friday afternoon if it's nice weather, Jay. And just listen.
I know. I always try to slow down.
Do a conference call.
Okay, yeah, we'll do that.
Or just sit in Barry any evening.
Right.
I was there last night.
Yeah, no, I agree. No, it's a good bill.
No, he's downtown.
Yeah. It's always really dangerous to comment on a bill that you haven't seen, but having said that, it certainly sounds like something I would support.
One more quick question, not from Mark or Perry. You're just not going to have an easy question. Yes, sir.
Will I guess the code for this foundation formula, will it be open source in the sense that we can all see it? Kind of be, but beyond just a big PDF full of words, but the actual program that does these calculations. Hopefully it's not like a proprietary thing, but
No,
that hidden.
that would be very transparent.
Yeah. So there's not some company creating this thing.
No. We will have, the governor's, the administration is consulting with a professional group, specialized in designing these formulas in other states. But they're not hiding anything. They're just pitching.
My understanding is it's in the bill. Like you can go read it and see what the actual language is that would direct, the formula. Like it's set.
More like the computer program that it's not someone writing it down on a piece of paper.
Well, yeah, I mean, the bill would then be, the language, the mathematics that would be implied by the bill would be converted into some sort of a computer program, presumably, which would then, spit out the numbers for, that we would then use. But it seems like it would be easy enough to check, because you'd know what it's supposed to do, and you'd be able to figure out what the inputs would be, and then run it yourself.
And I think this kind of relates to former Senator McDonald's last question, which we didn't answer, which is regarding local votes versus the math on the state level. What are we on the hook for? We gotta fund education each budget cycle based on the numbers we get. The yield bill, how we set the property tax rate statewide, is based on the votes of every school district and the budgets that pass all across the state. So right now, we just sort of have to comply, and I think that there's going to be a lot of conversation about the definition of local control, where it exists, and where it is in fact a myth, because we have to change the way we craft budgets in the state.
There's a second major input that you have to kind of assume, or you have to take a guess at, and that's to calculate the weights. And the weights are based on the socioeconomic well-being of the members within your district. So the number of people who are on food assistance, the number of people who are Medicaid. So those numbers are also
full disclosure, this is my twin brother, Sam Hooper. He serves on the school board in
Mark has one last question.
We're discussing how the money is divvied up fairly, equitably. Right now, that's what we're talking about.
Right.
I'm asking, how is the money that's going to be divvied up collected, and who decides how it's collected from whom? Under the proposal.
I see what you're saying.
Not how it's being divvied up. What do you start with? How is that the bill? How does the bill do that?
I mean, in terms of how the property taxes and the other pieces that go into the ed fund raised?
How much money? Who decides how much money there is to be divvied up amongst all the towns?
Well, I think it's starting out in the bill as what that base number is for the foundation formula. That number is in the bill. That's part of what we're negotiating in the legislature right now.
I think
That's for this year.
For when the foundation formula and all this would take effect in the future.
And next year, who establishes that number?
Well, that's what we are in disagreement about currently. The Senate and the House and the governor. That's why I said what's your name in the back there? Sean, to answer Sean's question from earlier about like how many different foundation formulas have been pitched, it's basically 3 because of those 3 figures. We on the House side of things have, I think, the highest pitch. We said, let's go maximal, right? Which is, of course, the thing that education spending shouldn't be something that we think about like shrinking. It should be about like maximizing our investments, spending guidelines, right? Like it shouldn't be about like cutting budgets from the bottom, like the ground level. That doesn't work. And like, unfortunately, right, that's kind of the tone, that's like the landscape we live in right now. You can't cut your way out of crisis. You have to be more deliberate about how you.
How is the more deliberate deliberation? Who makes that?
The legislature. We, the legislature, have to create spending guidelines for school districts. So you can't, so for example, I don't want to see a school install in every classroom a drop-down projector 1 year before they put a smartboard at the front of the classroom. That's a waste of money, right? It's a bad investment.
Mr. Moderator, I'm failing to answer.
Yeah, so let's have you guys privately talk that one out. I'll drive my car around so you can have headlights. So you guys have a good headlights.
One last thing. If you notice, this map has 2 deserts.
Yeah.
Anybody want to guess why?
Low income. No.
Not.
Oh, private school.
Those historic academies. Burton is down here in Manchester. St. Johnsbury and Linden Institute up in the Northeast Kingdom. So these are the subtleties of this kind of display that are lost by our insistence that you have some expert come and put their name brand. I'm happy to share my crayons with everybody. Okay?
You need more differentiation between the green and the blue.
I agree.
We need more, right on. Thank you, everybody coming.